¿Listo? Bueno, muchas gracias. Empezamos entonces. Antes de empezar, unos mínimos acuerdos de convivencia. El primero es, recuerden que vamos a mantener los micros silenciados para evitar interrupciones durante la sesión y la ponencia. Si tienen alguna duda o pregunta, usen el chat, que esa es la segunda invitación. El chat es de ustedes. Pueden por ahí comunicarnos sus preguntas, reflexiones, recomendaciones. Está abierto durante toda la sesión y bueno, en su espacio. Y por último, sabemos que vamos a tocar temas sensibles para muchas personas, así que si en algún momento necesitan un espacio, desactiven el espacio virtual, activen el espacio físico. Hagan cosas que los tranquilicen, busquen su zona de confort, pónganse de piel, hagan un bailecito de la felicidad, lo que mejor les sirva, y regresen cuando lo necesiten, ¿vale? Y bueno, la agenda de hoy vamos a tener, bueno, ya vamos en la bienvenida, vamos a tener luego las palabras de la doctora Ross, que nos acompaña hoy, y luego vamos a tener una sesión de preguntas junto con un corto y breve cierre. Listo, le doy la palabra a Mónica Roa para que haga la introducción de nuestra.
Muchas gracias y bienvenido todo el mundo. Nos alegra muchísimo tener esta sesión. Sobre nuestra invitada de hoy, podemos decir muchas cosas para presentarla, pero seguramente lo que hoy nos interesa resaltar es que ella fue fundadora de la teoría de la justicia reproductiva y es experta en feminismo, racismo y derechos humanos. En algún momento trabajó rehabilitando antiguos miembros de grupos de odio en la época de Martin Luther King y además posteriormente eligió utilizar su propia historia como sobreviviente de violación y de incesto para facilitar la conversación con violadores encarcelados. En su carrera activista, ella se ha preocupado por reivindicar la humanidad de sus antagonistas y de buscar cuáles son los valores que tienen en común. Y esto porque está convencida de que hay que hacer todo lo necesario para acabar con el odio y con la discriminación, apelando a encontrar lo que nos une e invitar a dialogar incluso a quienes creemos que no lo merecen. Y tal vez lo que para mí es más importante, ella está convencida de que el activismo debe ser una actividad que nos traiga goce y alegría. Por esta razón y porque creemos que esta es una conversación urgente, le agradecemos muchísimo a Loretta haber invitado la invitación y le cedo la palabra.
Gracias, Moni. Y bueno, yo voy a dejar de compartir pantalla para que Loretta nos comparta su presentación.
Well, thank you for inviting me to this conversation. I've done political activist work for over 50 years, and I am convinced that our need for our human rights activism is more urgent than ever because we're fighting the global rise of fascism around the world. And I believe that the best antidote to fascism is promotion of the human rights framework. So that's the lens through which I will be talking today. I believe that what I'm going to talk about, the calling in culture, will be as important to the human rights movement in the 21st century as nonviolence strategies were to the civil rights movement in the 20th century. A statement of how we do the work, not just what we focus on, but how well we treat each other. And I feel another sense of urgency because the people who are opposed to human rights mistakenly believe that they are fighting us. But I think they're wrong because they're fighting forces that are much bigger than us and much bigger than them. Because they're fighting the truth. They're fighting evidence. They're fighting history. And most of all, they're fighting time. They are trying to roll the clock back, deny truth, deny evidence, and deny history. So in one way, if you think about it, we have all of those things on our side. We have truth, time, evidence, and history fighting for us, which is a pretty good poker hand, I believe. But our problem is we risk snatching defeat from the jaws of victory with our call-out culture as we cannibalize each other, thinking that we have the correct political analysis, and if everybody doesn't agree with us, then they must be an enemy to us. And so I'm going to share a PowerPoint with you that analyzes the call-out culture, and then at the end talks about how we change the call-out culture into a calling-in culture. But I would also add, before I get to my PowerPoint, that we need to be very careful how we're destroying our human rights organizations from within. You know, where we're distrustful of leadership, where we accuse people of not being radical enough. The problem that we have is that the human rights movement is supposed to end oppression. It is not the job of the human rights movement to serve as your personal therapy space. Some people need to get therapy, instead they're going for their keyboards. And so I'm using my 5 decades of experience having conversations with people that I don't necessarily agree with, and I certainly don't even like sometimes. But I know that they're necessary to join the struggle to end human rights violations. And they may have different reasons from joining the struggle than I do, but I welcome them into my movement, because when many different people are thinking many different thoughts, but they're moving in the same direction, that's what a movement is. But when many different people are thinking one thought and they're moving into the same direction, that's a cult. And so we have to give up those cult-like thinkings and behaviors if we want to build a movement for power based on many different people coming from many different places, but all moving in the same direction together. That's what the women's movement is. We do not all belong to the same organization, but we are united in our commitment to end patriarchy, even if we work on it in many different ways, with different consciousness, with different understandings, and sometimes with even different definitions of feminism. But we work together and we're moving in the same direction. So with that preamble, let me share my screen with you. Hopefully you can see the screen. Can somebody speak up and ensure me that they are?
Yes, it's working.
Thank you.
Sí, confirmamos que está funcionando.
Okay, let me keep on. I believe that we should work towards a united human rights movement, and we have not used this unifying framework enough, in my opinion. That's because many neoliberal capitalist governments abuse the framework as they try to impose their economic, social, and political and religious priorities on other people. But we should not give up on human rights just because people abuse the concept of them. I'm part of the women's rights wing of the human rights movement because I care about racial justice. I'm part of the civil rights wing of the human rights movement, and I'm disabled. So I care about the disability rights wing of the human rights movement. And I fight racism, homophobia, transphobia. So I'm part of the anti-bigotry rights wing. I'm giving you all of this framework to understand that if you join the human rights movement with a radical and superior consciousness, then you also understand that you cannot do human rights work in a way that creates contradictions for your own movement. In other words, I cannot do work for women's rights in a racist way without creating contradictions for my movement. I can't do work against racism in a homophobic way without creating contradictions. I can't work to save the environment if I'm going to do it in a way that ignores the needs of poor people who are most damaged by environmental problems. I can't do work for transgender rights if I'm going to do it in a way that is misogynistic. So learning that we're all part of the same movement, and yet we do have the right and the strategy to focus on different things is part of us learning how to build power together. I've created something called the C5 continuum, which is comprised of what I'm showing you: calling out, canceling, calling in, calling on, and calling it off. And I will explain each of those terms. Calling out is publicly shaming or humiliating people for things that you think they've done wrong, and you want to hold them accountable for that. The problem with the call out culture is that it doesn't work, because when people are humiliated and shamed for something you think that they've done wrong, chances are they're not going to admit that they've done something wrong, because they are experiencing from you a personal attack on them, on their morality, on their character, on their way of thinking. And so a lot of people in the human rights movement use calling out because that's the way they think that they're going to achieve accountability and force people to change. But it doesn't work, because if we had the magic words to force others to change, then couples wouldn't fight, families wouldn't fight, people who work together wouldn't fight. We don't have those magic words. The ultimate call out is number 2, and that's canceling somebody. When you believe that somebody should lose their job or their platform or their reputation because you think they've done something for which they should be held accountable. But we've also learned that canceling doesn't work except on vulnerable people. But the rich and the powerful, they keep making money. They keep getting on television. They keep harming people. So canceling really doesn't work. I'm not surprised that so many people want to use the call out culture and the canceling culture, because they believe that is the right way to do human rights work. But I would argue that you have to use the call out or the cancellation as the tactic of last resort, not the tactic of first resort. Before you call a government or a corporation or an individual out, you try to talk to them first. You try to meet them where they are. You try to maybe send a more effective messenger to talk to them. You try many different steps in the human rights movement before you get to the ultimate step of calling someone or a corporation or a politician or somebody else out. But a lot of people in this era of social media and internet fame, they don't want to take time to do all those other steps. They just want to go to the cancellation, go to the calling out. And what that means is that is that they're doing the right thing the wrong way. Along the continuum is calling in, the third part of the continuum. Calling in is really a calling out, but instead of using anger, blaming, and shaming as your method of accountability, you're choosing to use love and respect. I find that because I have a very quick temper and I get so outraged at injustice that I very frequently have to call myself in before I can call anybody in or out, because I really want to sometimes visit my trauma and my anger on other people, because it is very true that hurt people hurt other people. And I have to call myself in to remind myself that if I want to be strategically effective in creating change, then visiting my trauma and my pain on someone else is not going to get me that. All it's going to do is hurt them and make them hurt like I hurt. Calling on the fourth step is their intermediate step. When you don't want to invest the emotional energy or the time into another person's growth, then you have the option of calling on them to do better. An example of calling on somebody would be, I can't believe you just said that to me. Do you really want to say that way? Or I really need you to tell me whether or not you're the good friend that I know you are, or the person that just said those hateful words out of your mouth. Calling on offers people a chance to align their good opinion of themselves with their external behaviors. And so if you know somebody and you can sincerely say that they're a good person, then calling on requests that they demonstrate that they're a good person with the way that they behave towards others. Fifth one is calling it off. This is the strategy of disengagement. When you have decided that you are in a non-productive conversation with someone, that people are lying or cheating or misrepresenting your views as well as their own, or if they're engaging in personal attacks instead of dealing with the issues, then you have the right to call it off. And this can be done either in person or over social media. You have no obligation to continue unproductive conversations. So why do we want calling in? We want the calling in to create a culture of accountability, because we want to demonstrate and model the world that we want to build. It's not enough to define what we're fighting against. We have to be able to define what we're fighting for. If we cannot distinguish ourselves from those who are opposed to human rights, why would anyone want to listen to us? We also have to learn how to deal with harm without creating more harm. Just because we've all experienced trauma, that does not give us an excuse or a license to inflict more trauma on somebody else. And if we want this human rights-based society where everybody is included, and it's not just an ideal or an aspiration, we're going to have to learn calling in techniques and bring more people into the movement. And once they get here, to make it fun to be here, to show them how much joy there is in learning how to master oneself's emotions, how to create containers where people can engage in their honest dialogues without fear of saying the wrong thing in case somebody jumps on them for not having the right words or not getting the gender pronouns right or whatever. We've got to make it fun. One of the things I frequently say is that fighting Nazis should be fun, because it's being a Nazi that really is problematic. And so we need to make sure that we understand that there's no logical reason for anybody to join us in this human rights movement if we make them feel worse about themselves after they join us than before they came. And as I said, how we do the work, our processes are as important as the outcomes, because you cannot use, lying tactics, humiliating tactics, violent tactics, and then expect good outcomes of that. We should also invite ourselves to engage more in self-reflection and self-correction. We are not perfect as we do this human rights work, but we don't have to be. The movement is perfect. We get to bring our imperfect selves to the work, be honest with what we do well and what we do badly, and self-correct and self-reflect. And we really have to stop replicating the oppressive tendencies within our movement that we're fighting in the larger society. So calling in allows us to learn healing strategy for ourselves and others. Calling out, of course, is what we all know about, because we criticize how other people are doing their social justice work. But interestingly, we're rarely critical of our own social justice practices, because we think we figured it out and everybody else who doesn't agree with us must be wrong. Calling out is often driven by people feeling unheard or disrespected or violated. And this happens a lot within our social justice organizations, where people do not have the skills in which to have constructive conversations with each other, respecting each other's differences. Instead, they call people out. And the problem with the call out culture is that it works on the assumption that everybody has already grown, instead of accepting that we're all growing in some kind of way. The other thing that drives the call out culture is when people are publicly using knowledge as a weapon against each other. So that if you've learned how to define neoliberal capitalism, and then you criticize others who don't have that kind of economic understanding of how the world works, then you are really showing off and trying to pretend that you're more sophisticated or smarter than you are. We also have a tendency to want to banish people or criticize people because they're not woke enough. This is a word in English that comes out of the Black community. I'm not quite sure how well it translates into Spanish. But the fact that you think you're in a woke competition only proves that you're not as woke as you think you are, because we're not in a consciousness competition. We're in a power building competition to end human rights violations. And so picking on people, criticizing people for them being in a different place on the consciousness continuum than you are, shows that you have a lack of a sophisticated analysis. I find that people use their social justice activism also to boost their ego or their standing in community. A lot of times people are calling each other out over the internet because they want the attention that is given to them when they publicly shame somebody else, because it makes them feel good about themselves. Except that that is the worst way to get attention. Matter of fact, all you're going to get is attention that won't even last. And that's why people end up increasing the outrage so that they can go for more attention. And one thing people often do as well as believe that they have to seek political purity of opinion. Like if I think that something should be done one way or a word should be used another way, anybody who doesn't agree with me must be doing something wrong. And this means that a lot of shaming and ideological bullying takes place through the call-out culture. Now, there is a reason that the call-out culture is being criticized by the fascist movement right now. And that's because any sober assessment of this history must conclude that the present objections to cancel culture are not so much concerned with the weapon as the kind of people who now seek to wield it. Until recently, cancellation flowed exclusively downward, from the powerful to the powerless. In other words, as long as the rich, elite, and powerful were punching down, they didn't have any problems with the call-out culture. But now, in this era of fallen gatekeepers, where anybody with a Twitter handle or a Facebook account can be a publisher, banishment has been ostensibly democratized. So what the fascists don't like is that the people that they previously had a monopoly on victimizing are now punching back. And that's why the call-out culture is criticized. But we need to be clear. We also need to criticize the call-out culture, not because of what the fascists are saying, but because of the damage we're doing to our own human rights movement. But there are appropriate uses of call-outs when there are power disparities, when people who are abusing others, harming others, make themselves intentionally inaccessible to any kind of correction. Sometimes you have to call people out to avoid increasing harm. Let's say you want to talk to them privately and they continue to exhibit the same behaviors, then sometimes you need to call them out. You can build community through calling people out by finding others who experience similar harms and spread information. You can also identify those sites of harm, naming unmarked or hidden structures or privileges. And you do this by lifting up the voices from those who have been historically silenced, the ones who were punched down on. And certainly you can use call outs to release your outrage, because sometimes you just can't hold it in. You've got to let it go. And there are rare times when public shaming works. But most call outs don't achieve this goal, no matter how much we would like them to. I want to give an analysis of how quickly call-outs can spiral out of control. And I'm using this analysis from trans activist Natalie Wynn. The first thing that happens, instead of a presumption of innocence, there's a presumption of guilt. So let's say somebody says something in a meeting and another person says, what you said is racist or sexist or toxic. The minute that accusation is said, there's a presumption that the person who's been accused has to automatically be guilty of that thing. And then in the second step, it gets so quickly abstracted that it becomes essentialized. And essentialism is where it's attached to their moral character. So it goes from you said something racist, sexist, or toxic to you are racist, you are sexist, you are toxic. So now you're condemning the person's entire moral being. And the people who are doing this kind of condemnation are usually doing it from a false or pseudo-moralistic or intellectual point of view. I am Black, so I know what racism is. I am a woman, so I know what misogyny is. I am trans, I know what transphobia is. And all of this ignores the fact that there's a considerable debate in all of those communities on the definitions of those words. And so this pseudo-moralism means people get on their high political horse and act like they are the truth tellers and the arbitrators of reality. And this is based on a very dualistic false binary system of right, wrong, good, bad, angel, devil, on and on. And so it's often the people with the most primitive, simplified analyses that end up doing this kind of pseudo-moralism or intellectualism. And then the sixth step is when the call out has taken place, when the person who's been targeted tries to apologize for whatever happened, whether it was true or not, because remember, there's been no investigation into whether this person actually is racist or sexist or toxic or transphobic. There's no investigation. There's no due process. So let's say the person says, okay, if you say I've harmed you, please forgive me. The fact that they've asked for forgiveness is interpreted as them trying to take advantage of the system. But if they say, I did nothing wrong, I don't have to ask for your forgiveness because I did nothing wrong, then they're going to be interpreted as trying to evade accountability. So it's a lose-lose for them. They're damned if they do, and they're damned if they don't. And then for those of us who aren't caught up in being the accuser or the accused, there's a contamination infection aspect of this. Because if you speak up in defense of due process, or even in defense of settling people down and pulling people back from the accusation and fighting stuff, then you're going to be accused of enabling or going along with the person who was accused of being racist, toxic, or whatever. And so that's where the political shunning starts to happen, where people don't want to be associated with people who experience that call out. And this is part of the tendency that is destroying the human rights movement. And a large part of this happens because we don't know how to actually define harm. So that we now use the word harm just when we overuse it, when people don't simply have the same opinions on things, or don't know the latest language to use, or have a different set of lived experiences different from somebody else. So harm is when we experience physical, emotional, psychological injury, or when we cause others physical, emotional, or psychological injury. Harm is when an abuse or misuse of power takes place with the intent purposes of keeping others from accessing their human rights. And sometimes harm comes from an outcome of misunderstanding or assumptions or mistake. But what harm is not is when we disagree with each other over personal or political issues. As long as we conduct our disagreements in ways that respects the humanity of each other's, that's not harm. And sometimes we define harm when somebody makes us uncomfortable by requesting accountability or requesting that we examine the impact of our behaviors. Because when you choose to call somebody out and you silence everybody else in the room, you are causing harm to the other people who would have liked to participate in the conversation. And the fact that we have been harmed and have gone through trauma is not meant to be a bargaining chip or a competition or a commodity that gives us an advantage in difficult or challenging situations. What you have been through is your lived experiences, but it is not a resume. You're not an expert on a topic until you've added your lived experiences with some book learning so that you actually get a range of information and opinions to study a topic so that you can evolve into an expert on it. So too many people assume that what they've been through is all that they need to know to define themselves as an expert on a subject. And that is not true. So we end up overstating harms because we don't have a lot of healthy models for dealing with conflict and harm. But we've got to first understand that it's impossible to navigate life without hurting someone else or getting hurt. This assumption that we're supposed to be able to go through life without anybody else getting on our nerves or hurting our feelings or making us uncomfortable is not a realistic assumption. And when we reduce ourselves exclusively to this hurt, we find ourselves exaggerating or overstating the harm. And what this does is keeps us from building the resilience and the coping skills necessary in order to have dynamic and productive relationships. I would argue that my mother and father, much as they loved me, were the people in my life most capable of causing me harm. Not in any child abuse or neglectful way, but because I cared so much about their opinions that if they didn't give me that positive feedback I wanted, then I would feel hurt by them. But that doesn't mean that I would say, okay, my mother abused me because she didn't give me the positive feedback I wanted. I could overstate the harm, but it wouldn't be true. It is often a lot easier to address the symptoms of an issue than a root cause. Instead of saying, you did not hear me or I feel disrespected, let's go underneath that and find out, why are you always feeling disrespected? Why are you always feeling unheard? What trauma rests in your past that gets triggered in the present that you're now imposing on the rest of the people? Because our feelings stimulated by trauma and harm are very real. I'm not denying the reality of those feelings, but they're not necessarily factual. Just because you feel silenced doesn't mean you actually are being silenced. And sometimes we want to be validated completely in our experiences, even as our intellect tells us that life is far more complicated than that. So calling out becomes very toxic. It replicates the prisons, the carceral system of punishment. We say that we don't want more people to go to jail. We don't want more people to be harmed by the prisons, yet we use these same kind of prison tactics on each other of silencing, punishment, exile, socially forgetting people. And it discourages people from wanting to become human rights activists by frightening them into not wanting to speak up to tell their truth. It drives people away from the movement. It also disguises our privilege while we weaponize our language. And it makes accountability very difficult, because why would anybody ever admit that they've made a mistake if all that's going to happen is people jump on them for having admitted that they're only human? And it increases the harm rather than promotes healing. And it also devalues the lived experiences of people. What someone else has been through will not be what you have been through. And so you can't invalidate their experiences no more than you would accept them invalidating yours. Call out also isolates people instead of bringing them together, because it promotes a culture of cynicism and hopelessness. And quite often the whole call out spirals out of control, disproportionately in relationship to the original incident. Like if someone gets, a word wrong, all of a sudden, if you summon this call out mob on them for getting the word wrong, so getting the word wrong might have been a minor thing, but now it's been blown up into a major conflict. And it becomes very viral when it's done through social media, because it's one thing for one person to say something bad about you, but it's another thing when they get 10,000 of their friends to say the same bad thing, because that diminishes one's feeling of worth, one's feeling of humanity. So I don't want to read all of this because of lack of time, but Trauma shows up in our work through lowered self-esteem, standing in the community, shame, guilt, paralysis, hopelessness. We don't believe that people can grow, that they're fixed where they are. It ends up fracturing our social, family, and political relationships. Sometimes we avoid dealing with each other, or we don't even want to touch these uncomfortable topics. We become very dogmatic or closed-minded around thinking new things, allowing new information in. We get bored or we get cynical, despair, a lack of occupation or excitement. Sometimes we isolate, even in a crowd, we isolate ourselves. We also end up being radicalized sometimes, go to the extreme of people's thinking. We often self-censor ourselves, deceive ourselves, and we project onto others the behaviors that we're exhibiting. We become argumentative. A lot of self-harm happens because of trauma through substance abuse, alcohol abuse, things like that. A lot of self-harm happens because we all have we all can experience abandonment issues. And these harms can be intergenerational, and they affect race, class, and gender relations. And of course, there's spiritual harm, our lack of contact with anything that can provide us comfort and solace. So when you are called out, whether you're called in or out, you're going to have the same emotional reactions to it. You're going to feel very defensive, shut down, feel like you're getting mobbed by bullies, very angry and isolated, very hurt and unheard. You're going to believe that what you believe is unimportant. Sometimes you respond by attacking others, or a lot of people report that they just go numb. They don't know what to say, or you deny that any harm has taken place. Sometimes people pivot and deflect to other issues or engage in ad hominem attacks, which are personal attacks against other people, or counterattacking them, or they dismiss what's being said. Doubling down means that they not only say something harmful, but then they do it again. Or they create a false equivalence. What about this? What about that? Both sides do it. Or they break down in tears or sabotage the political work, or they just get so outraged that they don't want to talk to anybody else. So let me pivot and spend my last 15 minutes talking about a growth mindset through calling in. As I said, calling in is a call out done with love, with radical love, because we've got a radical analysis. We just don't have the radical love to go along with that analysis. And it's all about a process of achieving accountability. It starts with giving each other the benefit of the doubt, not assuming the worst about each other, because quite often we're working from incomplete information anyway. And it really requires working to acknowledge that diverse people can be on the same team and still have differences of opinion. And it's helpful to remember the broader context. When you're calling people in, you need to learn and use active, loving listening practices. Don't be so preoccupied in what you want to say to somebody else without pausing to make sure you carefully listen to them in the first place. And it's really important to be grateful to people for a shared learning opportunity, because if we use this calling in culture, this calling in approach, we can grow better together. And so even if someone calls us in or out, we actually should do 3 things if we get called out or in. Number 1, thank the person for giving you their time and attention, because time and attention are the most precious commodities in the world right now. The internet companies are fiercely competing for our time and attention. And so you can sincerely thank them as your first step for giving you that time and attention. The second step is to say, I've heard you, and I'm going to take what you've said into consideration. With the second step, you conveyed that you've paid attention to them, that you've heard them, but what you have not said is that you agree with them. But you have said, I am going to consider what you've said in my own time and space, and then decide whether or not what you said was true and whether I need to change my behavior or my words or my thinking. But if you assure people in that second step that they've been heard, that's generally all you need to do. You don't have to offer agreement too. And then the third step, if you're called in or out, is to turn the calling out into a calling in. And you can use a sample sentence like this. Thank you for calling that to my attention. I will take what you said under consideration. And by the way, I'm pretty sure you could have gotten my attention without calling me out. So I want to ask, are you okay? Because you chose to get my attention in that way when you probably could have picked up the phone and talked to me or done it in another way. So is someone messing with you? Are you hurt? Are you angry? And the reason I ask is because I care as much about you as I do myself. But that 1, 2, 3, thanking them, telling them they've been heard, calling them in as the third step, you can handle almost every call out that occurs to you in life. And you're doing it with grace and respect. So it begins, though, with self-assessment. You have to analyze how you feel and why you want to call somebody in. If you're not in a healed enough space from your own trauma to have a difficult conversation, chances are all you're going to do is bleed all over somebody else, because it is not your obligation to call anybody in or out. It's a choice that you get to make. And sometimes you're not in that emotional space where you want to make that choice. So it's okay to walk away. That's when you use the call it off choice, because you're not in that space. But once you do that assessment and you know where your emotions are, you can recognize that your emotions, like happiness, can make you feel more creative and open. Or if you're feeling fearful, it's going to make you more shut down. And so depending on where you are will help determine whether or not you're in an emotional space to want to call somebody in or out. It is important to recognize that you don't have the power to change other people, but you can only offer love and respect. You do not have the power to magically impose another way of thinking, being, or behaving on anybody, but you can offer them love and respect. And you still may disagree, but that's okay, because people do have the right to have their different opinions. Now, this self-assessment, when you're trying to embrace the calling in culture, does require you to look back into your childhood. Can you forgive yourself for your previous mistakes is a very important question, because when you were a child and you made a mistake, and if people severely punished you and shamed you for making that mistake, then you're going to think it's normal to punish and shame other people for making mistakes your entire adult life. But if when you were a child and you made a mistake and the person comforted you, showed you what you could have learned from that mistake, offered you grace and forgiveness, then chances are you're going to be capable of offering that grace and forgiveness to someone else. And so the question we get to ask ourselves as adults is, do I want to continue to act out the patterns of my childhood around punishment, blaming, and shaming? Or do I want to make a different choice that's better representative of who I am now? And that's going to mean forgiving myself for the mistakes that I will continue to make, and learning how to forgive others for the mistakes that they inevitably will make. And so this is why forgiveness is so important as a calling in practice. Because forgiveness is something you do for yourself before you can forgive others. You have to forgive yourselves for the times you knew you should have spoken up, but you were scared. The times you spoke up for yourself and it didn't change things. The times you harshly judged others for their differences of opinion or life experiences. The ways your life has turned out differently than you thought it would. Forgive yourself for not knowing enough, not being enough, not doing enough, letting society judge you. Forgive yourself for the ways others have hurt you and caused you to believe in negative messages about yourself. And it's really important to forgive yourself for not knowing what you don't know. So if you're going to take steps towards forgiveness, start with the self-forgiveness you caused others or yourself. Deal with the hurt or the harm you experience. Sometimes this is through professional therapy or peer group counseling or through religion or whatever. Understand your fear of feeling this way again and ask, do you want to go around making other people feel that way? Explore why what they said or did challenges you or your values. And sometimes you need to determine the timing for making amends or offering grace, apologies, or forgiveness. Sometimes people are not in a space to even hear from you, and you have to let it go. You're not in control of that. We will all be afraid, so we need to anticipate the fear, but not let it stop us. And I claim that we should reach for each other's humanity and integrity as a part of reclaiming our own power and dignity. We should learn to speak to each other as if we're holding their heart in our hand and we don't want to squeeze it too tight, because that's how tender we want other people to be with our heart. So we've got to build resilience instead of fragility. Now, resilience is the ability to respond and adapt to changing experiences, not letting our whole lives be defined by conflict, harm, or pain, but learning how to incorporate new information and new experiences. This is not the same as taking it laying down, like you're just supposed to just never ever acknowledge that you've been harmed and all of that. That is not true forgiveness, because forgiveness is a reclamation of your own dignity. You are committing to not let somebody else done to you permanently determine your destiny or your life path. One way we describe it is, why would you give somebody else the remote control to your life? You have to be strategic in how you direct your anger and pain. And this is something that we work out in relationship with other people. We also, is very useful if we can very systematically address and identify, where do you go to get your needs met? Where do I go to get affirmed? Where do I go to get challenged? Where do I go to collaborate with others? And we need to learn our own capacity for forgiving, for expressing gratitude, for learning how to give effective apologies, accepting things as they are while changing things that must be changed, and finding meaning in our lives and stuff. So if you're in the middle of a call out culture and you need to interrupt the call out, here's some helpful sentences or steps that you can take. You can center yourself in your love practices so that you can remain calm. You can speak up through your discomfort and remind people of their human rights values and their need for each other. You can check the emotional temperature of the room to enlist others to build joy and love. Sometimes you need to redirect the conversation back to the agenda because it's strayed from the agenda based on someone else imposing their trauma on the meeting. You can have individual conversations with people who are called out or who are calling others out, saying, okay, was this the right time to raise that? Or what's going on with you that you would raise that way. You can help people identify problematic behaviors with specifics for change, and you should always be prepared to make a plan for future conversation. When you're building a calling in culture, different people will play different roles based on where they are in their emotional journey. Sometimes you're the survivor whose rights have been violated, or you're the advocate for the survivor who's trying to make sure that these violations don't continue. Sometimes you're the intervener. You're seeing both sides of the conflict and you're trying to help people calm things down or keep the progress moving. Sometimes you're the healer, because people who are become so vulnerable by exposing their trauma often needs a healer to pay attention to them so that they don't get re-traumatized by neglect. Or you could be the bridge builder, the person who's trying to say, well, I agree with this, I agree with this. Do y'all see what common ground y'all have so that we can move forward and build upon that? Sometimes you don't have the emotional bandwidth to do anything. And so it's okay to be a bystander and say, I don't want to get into this conflict because I've had an awful day and there's nothing productive I can contribute to this conversation. Sometimes we need a witness or a reflector, someone who keeps careful note of what went down, when did it go wrong, what was said, so that can be echoed back to the people so that someone can actually provide a more objective accounting. Sometimes in the call out culture, there's an abuser, which is the person who harmed the survivor. The common ground builder and the bridge builder will work together. The common ground builder will be much more strategic, though, in terms to achieve an outcome. The question asker is the person who will say, well, wait a moment, before we got into this call out culture and so-and-so said something was racist, tell me what you thought was racist about the comment that they said. And sometimes there's a truth seeker, someone who says, okay, simply because you're feeling harmed and triggered by this conversation, why don't we find out the truth of where this actually is coming from? Did something similar to this happen to you in the past that this moment is now reminding you of? So those are examples of the different roles. So let me shut up, stop the share. I know I've given a lot of information, and now is the time for the question and answers. Thank you all for listening to me.
Muchísimas gracias, Loreto. De verdad que es un montón de información que seguramente nos confronta, pero también nos invita a reflexionar sobre cómo hacemos y cómo vivimos nuestro activismo.
Muchas gracias, Loretta, por esta...
Are we going to take like a quick break before the Q&A?
Uy, perdón, aquí estaba en mi...
I thought the agenda said for a 3-minute break.
Cami, estás en mute.
No, ya no vamos a tomárnoslos para alcanzar a hacer justamente las preguntas y tener más tiempo. No sé si, Moni, ¿tú estabas diciendo algo?
Estaba intentándolo.
Ah, no te oímos.
Hola, ¿me escuchan?
No.
Yo te oigo, Moni.
¿Sí?
Parece que otro
Vale,
sí.
ok.
Sí, Moni, te
Sí, es
oímos.
por el canal, perdón, ya. Es que estás
Vale.
en el canal de inglés.
Ah, perdón. Vale, ahora. Ok, entonces estaba diciendo que muchas gracias a Loreto por toda su presentación, que seguro nos confronta, pero también nos invita a repensar la manera en la que hacemos activismo. Y quería empezar con una pregunta que tengo desde hace mucho tiempo, o desde que empecé a intentar llevar este mensaje de la cultura de la invitación a otras colegas activistas. Y es que ellas sienten que la promover la cultura de la invitación es poner la otra mejilla y que en ese proceso pueden perder su dignidad. Y me gustaría saber cómo les responderías, porque es algo que me conflictúa mucho sentir que mi invitación a que ellas hagan la cultura de la invitación se esté leyendo de esa manera.
When you sophisticate your tactics, strategies, and analysis, that you can build a container big enough for many different people while being clear about what you believe and what you stand for, that's a statement of strength. That's not a statement of weakness. Only weak people are afraid to have conversations with people who disagree with them. Okay? Strong people are not afraid of that. Okay? Because they're very clear about what they stand for and what they believe. And they're not willing to weaponize their beliefs against other people. That's a sign of insecurity and weakness. And so it's a growth that we all can engage in and be surprised how much you can grow when you stop demonstrating your political insecurities by assuming that you can't have conversations with people who don't necessarily totally align with you. See, that's what I call movement fragility, not movement strength. But say it with love so that they don't feel humiliated. It's just like if somebody says, I like apples better than I like oranges. It's not a statement of you that they like oranges better. That shouldn't make you feel worse about yourself. You know what you like, they like what they like. Can't those two things coexist? It's an insecurity when you insist that everybody must like apples because I like apples. Now, that doesn't mean, see, the thing about political situations are supposed to be about constructive conflict and dialogue. If you don't have the friction of that dialogue and that conflict, how can you ever arrive at the best solution? You have to have many different ideas coming together so that the group has a chance to figure out what's the best solution for what we're trying to deal with. So don't be afraid of conflict or dialogue or difference. Just don't let it keep us from respecting each other and working together.
Aleja, sigue tú.
Ok. Hola Loretta, un gusto. Acá voy a hacer unas preguntas, que teníamos en nuestros documentos que hemos sintetizado de muchas otras preguntas que nos han hecho en otros momentos otras activistas. Una muy importante es cómo podemos plantear invitaciones cómo podemos plantear invitaciones a una plataforma digital tan complicada como Twitter.
I find that digital platforms are very bad for conveying nuance and complexity. And so you don't want to choose the wrong tool for your task, right? And so if I see somebody doing a call out on Twitter that I think is harmful, I might tweet back, I used to think that way, but I decided not to publicly embarrass people anymore. Bye. Or, you know, what are you getting out of publicly shaming somebody you don't know? do we need to talk? And so giving people who want to do the call out some loving attention as opposed to feeding their anger and outrage may be a strategy for responding.
Thank you, Loretta.
Otra pregunta, Loreto. Yo entiendo que dentro de tu propuesta hay una dimensión estratégica de que realmente el call out no funciona. Hay otra dimensión ética, que es recordar que siempre estamos con un ser humano enfrente y cómo recogemos toda su humanidad y su potencial para aprender, pero también para equivocarse. Y también empiezo a identificar que hay una invitación a hacer un trabajo de autoconciencia como activistas, con la manera en la que llegamos al activismo y lo que podemos ofrecer a los movimientos de los que hacemos parte. ¿Te estoy interpretando bien? ¿Están esas tres dimensiones involucradas?
Absolutely. I also don't want you to think that a call out is a solution for every situation. Or calling in is a solution for every situation. There are people who are very intentionally harming people. They're very intentionally profiting from the misery of people, and they're creating the conditions of harm for other people. Those are not the people I'm calling in. Those are the people I'm out organizing so that I can overwhelm them with the power of us, with the power of love, so that I can remove them from the positions where they can do harm. So I don't want you to leave here thinking that I'm trying to call in fascists. No, I'm not. I out-organize fascists, but I just assume that the majority of the people in the world are not fascists.
Ok, Loretta, ahora voy yo con otra que querían preguntar por acá en el chat, que es, acá está. ¿Cuáles ejercicios para la vida cotidiana recomendarías para aprender y sobre todo incorporar la cultura de la invitación?
Because I have a quick temper, I have lots of exercises every day to call myself in. And the more you do it, the more you develop the muscle memory to do it. For example, I flew home a couple of days ago and the airlines lost my luggage. And that was when I got to the city I was going to. But then when I came home, they had crushed and broke my wheelchair. I could have spent that entire trip calling out the airline, calling out the people who mishandled my wheelchair. I mean, I would have been totally self-justified in cursing a lot of people out. But I decided I wasn't going to let these problems of logistics steal my joy. And so I had to force myself through multiple conversations with the airline people and the hotel people and the everything people to remember I want to practice what I preach. I want to be kind. I want to be respectful. I want to see them as human beings who are trying to help me out instead of unfortunate people who are caught up in my logistical nightmare, you know? And you go through life every day with opportunities like that. Maybe not that dramatic, but the person who cuts you off while you're driving, or the student who, or the professor who does a microaggression that's racist or sexist or something like that. Each one of those, you get to choose how you're going to respond. And I'm urging you to choose the response that better represents your integrity, because your reputation is what other people think that they know about you. But your integrity is what you know about yourself. And so our job is to make sure we lead with our integrity. Damn the reputation, because you'll never be able to control what other people think about you, because they're only seeing you through the lens of what they've been through, not what you've been through. And so I'm one of those people that like being able to look in the mirror at night and liking what I see, because I didn't cause harm to other people simply because I had a messed up day. You know, I kind of like looking myself in the mirror like that.
Gracias, Loretta. Maravillosa pregunta, maravillosa respuesta. Sigue, Moni.
Una pregunta difícil. Quería saber si alguna vez has tenido la oportunidad de aplicar o de pensar cómo se aplica tu propuesta a la discusión que se ha creado dentro del feminismo entre feministas trans incluyentes y feministas trans excluyentes. Y si hay alguna lección que nos puedas compartir al respecto.
In many ways, I believe that is a manufactured conflict amongst the people who should be working together. Because there are as many different feminisms as there are feminists. You know, so don't come into the women's movement thinking that there's only one kind of feminism that everybody should embrace, because that's not how it works. There's that. Secondly, we can't get into the oppression Olympics with each other. I'm more harmed, you're more harmed, blah, blah, blah. Because that doesn't work. Everybody is harmed in a different way based on their vulnerabilities. Because part of the problem is that there's a misunderstanding of the Black feminist theory of intersectionality. A lot of people think intersectionality is a statement of identities. It is not. Intersectionality is a statement of your vulnerabilities. What about your identities make you vulnerable to a particular oppression that a person without that identity doesn't go through? The same way you can say all children have a right to an education, but a blind child might need her books in Braille. That's a statement of her vulnerability, not her identity as a blind person. You see what I'm saying? And so people tend to layer on their identities as if that's all the work that they need to do, without understanding that they have to not only know their own vulnerabilities, but work in solidarity with people with other vulnerabilities and stuff. That's how coalition and solidarity work. So there are people in the women's movement, and that's the other thing. Every movement has a left, a center, and a right. And so I find that I gravitate as a cisgendered woman to the left wing of the trans movement, because they offer a radical analysis around neoliberal capitalism and racism and and they're far less misogynist than the right wing of the trans movement. You know, and I gravitate, and the right wing of the women's movement will be more transphobic and more racist than the left wing of the women's movement. And so failing to analyze the continuum of the social justice movements with which we got to work is, again, an unsophisticated analysis, in my opinion. And so that's why so much of the conflict feels manufactured to me, because there's a reading of the right wing of the women's movement meeting the right wing of the trans movement as if that's representative of all the women's movement and all the trans movement. And that simply is not true.
Bueno, Loretta, ya llegamos al final del tiempo. De verdad que te agradecemos muchísimo tu tiempo. Esta última pregunta me abre otro montón de preguntas que me encantaría poder explorar contigo en otro escenario, pero queremos respetar tu tiempo y el de todas las personas que están aquí participando. De verdad que llevábamos muchos meses esperando poder tener esta conversación. Gracias de todo corazón porque creo que nos ofreces un montón de reflexiones que nos confrontan, pero que seguramente también nos invitan a hacer un activismo que entre otras resuena mucho con lo que siempre promovemos desde Puentes, todo esto de pensar en cómo ser estratégicamente eficaces, utilizar los mensajeros correctos que puedan interpelar a las audiencias a las que queremos llegar, a hablar de cuál es el mundo que queremos construir y no solamente el mundo que queremos rechazar, hacer divertido este trabajo del activismo, ser duros con el problema y suaves con las personas.
Joyful.
Sí, eso me encanta. Así es que muchísimas gracias. Creo que todos nos vamos con muchísima gratitud por tus reflexiones, por compartirlas con nosotros. Esperamos que estés mejor de salud y que nos volvamos a encontrar en algún momento. Aprovecho para darle las gracias a todo el equipo que también estuvo trabajando muy duro para organizar esta sesión y darle las gracias también a nuestros traductores a lengua de señas, a español, a portugués, a inglés y a toda la gente que nos dedicó un par de horas de su tiempo esta tarde. Creo que ya no nos volvemos a ver por este año, así es que tengan muy buenas fiestas con sus amigos y familiares. Yo soy muy Grinch, entonces no voy a decir feliz Navidad, pero sí disfruten, descansen, desconéctense, recarguen energías y nos vemos el próximo año. Adiós.
Bye bye. Adios.
Adiós, Loreto.
Muchas gracias a todos por conectarse. Un abrazo muy grande desde donde estén. Cuídense mucho.